The strange but true story featured on this podcast contains details some people may find unsettling. Listener discretion is advised. I'm Chyaz Samuel, and things are about to get weird. Hello there, and a very warm welcome back to Things Are About to Get Weird. Today, I'm going to be covering a topic that has captivated me for years. One that I genuinely can't believe it's taken me until episode 80 to talk about. The strange phenomenon known as the Mandela Effect. Not only am I going to be digging into some of the weirdest examples of this odd happening, but we're also going to look at the background, science, and possible theories that could help to explain why it occurs. Plus, I'm going to tell you about the time I ended up putting my investigative journalism skills into action to uncover the truth about a Mandela effect involving an early 2000s music video. Intrigued? You're definitely not alone. Let's get started. Now, first things first, what is the Mandela Effect? If you're thinking, that name sounds familiar, could this be something to do with the late South African president Nelson Mandela? Then you would be absolutely correct. When Nelson Mandela passed away in 2013 at the age of 95, amongst the sea of voices paying tribute to him were a notable group who all seemed to be asking the same disconcerting question. Didn't Nelson Mandela pass away in prison during the 1980s? What appeared to have happened is that a large number of people all had this shared false memory of an alternate reality. In this case, believing that Nelson Mandela had already died decades earlier. This is strange in itself, of course, but it actually gets even stranger, because as people started to look deeper into this weird shared memory of Mandela's passing, what they discovered was that some had been discussing this very idea for years prior to his actual death in 2013. Whilst many credit the paranormal writer and researcher Fiona Broome with coining the term Mandela Effect in around 2009 or 2010, others note that this odd tale was being spoken about even earlier than that, most notably by the broadcaster Art Bell, who is said to have mentioned his own memories of Nelson Mandela's death in the 80s on his late-night radio show Coast to Coast AM. And whilst I'm sure that the exact origins will continue to be debated on internet forums until the end of time, what can't be denied is that once this concept started gaining traction, it took on a life all of its own, especially online, because people were able to share their own experiences with what they believed to be a Mandela effect, and others could then chime in and confirm that they too shared that same alternative memory. It soon became clear that this initial example concerning Nelson Mandela was far from the only one of its kind. In fact, many of the cases that came to light were even more widespread and widely believed than the one that inspired the phenomenon's name. So, let's explore some of the most famous and most bizarre examples of the Mandela effect that continue to baffle entire groups of people. The moment you start looking into this subject, I would bet that one of the very first examples you'd come across would be the case of the Monopoly Man and his monocle, or lack thereof. I'm sure that the majority of us have played at least one round of Monopoly in our lives and have noticed the game's famous mascot with his moustache and top hat greeting us on the front of the box. But when you picture this dapper chap, do you remember him having an old-fashioned monocle? If you do, you're part of a huge collective who share that same memory. But I'm afraid to say that it's not actually true. The Monopoly Man, or Mr. Monopoly to cite his official title, does not have a monocle and never has. At least not in any of the classic standard games. There have been a couple of very specific instances where he has appeared with a monocle. For example, on some of the banknotes in a particular edition of one of the junior Monopoly games, but never in the game's general logo. In 2025, the market research company YouGov actually put together an article about Mandela effects, and the Mr. Monopoly example was one that they quizzed a cross-section of the British public about. They reported that 59% of people that they asked said that they did remember him having a monocle, with just 20% getting it correct by saying he did not wear one. The rest weren't sure. The more you think about those stats, the wilder it seems. How is it possible that that many people shared a false memory? We'll be getting to the more general theories about Mandela effects later on, but in this instance, it's been suggested that perhaps people's brains have been filling in the gap in a sense. The moustache, top hat, monocle combination is a relatively common trio when it comes to illustrations, or even things like fancy dress costumes with that link to the Victorian period. For those across the pond in the US who remember the monocle, it's thought that they could be merging two different logo characters in their minds, Mr. Monopoly and a figure called Mr. Peanut, who's the mascot of the snack food company Planters. Mr. Peanut is a giant peanut who wears a top hat and a monocle. Of course, the two look nothing alike. I mean, one's a man and one's an oversized peanut. But I could possibly see how this crossover could happen in some people's subconscious. I also couldn't possibly create this episode without mentioning another infamous logo-based Mandela effect, and I have to admit that this one really gets me. The clothing brand Fruit of the Loom had such a huge spotlight shined on it by the online groups discussing Mandela effects that the very top section of the FAQ page on their official website is dedicated to debunking the theory. There are thousands and thousands of people around the world who are convinced beyond any doubt that the Fruit of the Loom logo once featured a cornucopia, a horn-shaped basket with fruit spilling out of it. But as the brand themselves have confirmed, the official logo has never featured any kind of cornucopia basket and is only comprised of the fruit element. Now, as you know, I generally never like to use sources like Reddit during my research for the podcast, but in this instance, it's actually very useful because, after all, the whole point of Mandela effects is that they're based on the shared memories of real people, and real people tend to discuss these things on forums like Reddit. And when I tell you that there are entire communities that look to have come together based on this mutual belief that the Fruit of the Loom logo used to contain a cornucopia, I'm not exaggerating. One of the most frequent kinds of comments I read during my time spent going over countless posts discussing this topic was this, and this is truly fascinating. An astonishing number of people recall that they actually learned the word cornucopia as a child because they saw the Fruit of the Loom logo on their clothing tags and would ask an adult what that funny wicker-shaped basket was. Yet, according to the company themselves, this is impossible. Their website literally states, quote, Fruit of the Loom, in over 170 years of manufacturing, has never used, applied for, or registered a trademark design/logo depicting a cornucopia. The same kind of argument to the Monopoly Man example has often been used to try and debunk this Mandela effect, that images of these cornucopia baskets with the fruit arranged in front aren't unusual to see, and were in fact used quite commonly in things like Thanksgiving decorations, especially in decades past. Could this account for the prevalence of this shared memory? Or is something more otherworldly at play? Oof, I can't wait to get to the theories section, but first I would love to tell you about a few more of the examples that go beyond things like logos. One of the most interesting types of Mandela effects to me personally personally involve misremembered film quotes. There are multiple instances where particular lines from famous movies have become part of the vocabulary of large groups of people, when in fact the certain line they love to quote was never actually said in the film, or at least not in the way they remember it. I can't resist using an example which concerns one of my favourite films of all time to illustrate this one, and the masterpiece in question is The Silence of the Lambs. If you've seen the film, I want you to cast your mind back to the moment when Hannibal Lecter and Clarice Starling first come face to face, on either side of the glass wall of his prison cell. What do you think he says to her when he first lays eyes on her? If you recall Hannibal standing there in that creepy, almost rigid way he does before saying, "Hello, Clarice," then you're one of the many who have experienced this Mandela effect. Hannibal doesn't actually say the phrase, "Hello, Clarice," at any point during The Silence of the Lambs, not at their first meeting nor at any subsequent meetings. Yet you could argue that along with Hannibal's famous line about fava beans and his fondness for the phrase quid pro quo, "Hello, Clarice" is one of the most highly quoted and highly parodied lines from the film, despite the fact it never featured. Now, to be fair, there's a good chance that people might be getting confused between The Silence of the Lambs and its sequel, Hannibal, where Hannibal Lecter does utter this specific greeting. But with the first film in the series being the most iconic, I still think it's more than fair to categorize this as a Mandela effect, especially as there was a 10-year gap between the two movies being released. Another hugely misquoted line from a very well-known film is something that Darth Vader says to Luke Skywalker in Star Wars Episode 5, The Empire Strikes Back. I admit that I'm not the most knowledgeable person in the world when it comes to Star Wars, but I have seen all of the original trilogy films multiple times, and I would have absolutely fallen into the trap of thinking that this movie's most pivotal line was indeed, "Luke, I am your father." But it isn't. What Darth Vader actually says is, "No, I am your father." Yet, like with the Silence of the Lambs example, this is a line that I have heard quoted incorrectly more times than I could ever count. Whilst I was putting this episode together, I asked various friends of mine what they believed both of these lines to be, and more often than not, they too have believed the wrong quotes were actually accurate. I want to quickly tell you the story I alluded to in the introduction, because this relates to yet another type of Mandela effect that tends to be incredibly frustrating: false or alternative memories from music videos. All my fellow over 30s will know this, but music videos used to be such a huge deal. I know that in the early to mid 2000s in particular, I was nothing short of obsessed with the music videos put out by the bands and artists I loved, and I would sit there flicking between the different music TV channels on Freeview, just waiting and hoping that my favourite videos would come on. I'd also try to buy the CD singles of many of my favourite songs, as the music videos would sometimes be included on the disc. And I tell you, it's a good job I did, as a few years ago, one of my old CDs helped me to solve a Mandela effect for over 100,000 people over on TikTok. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while now, or have followed my various online journeys over the years, you won't be at all surprised to learn that the video in question was Skater Boy by Avril Lavigne. Back in 2021, I posted an initial video on TikTok referencing what I believed to be a Mandela effect within the Skater Boy video. I vividly remember a scene in the video where the fictional girl that Avril is singing about, the ex-girlfriend of the Skater Boy turned rock star, is sitting in a dingy room rocking her baby, watching her ex-boyfriend perform a gig on a small old-fashioned TV set. Bear in mind that I must have watched the music video hundreds of times as a teenager. But after finding it on YouTube and re-watching it after all these years, that scene was nowhere to be found. After I spoke about this over on TikTok, I had over 400 comments from my viewers, and many of them told me that they remembered the same thing I did. So I decided to investigate and share my findings in a follow-up video. I dug out my trusty old Skater Boy CD single, found an old laptop that could still play CDs, and set up 2 screens for comparison purposes. One playing the music video off the CD and the other playing it from YouTube. And what I confirmed, despite myself and hundreds of others being convinced the scene existed, was that it didn't. It wasn't present in either version, they were identical. After I made this revelation, people left all sorts of theories of their own in this new comment section. Some wondered whether there had been an alternative edit that was shown on some music channels, or whether we'd all misremembered an aspect from a different music video from the same time. But others said, no, the version I remember never had that scene, and some even questioned whether there was some kind of conspiracy at play. We all know how much the internet loves a conspiracy theory involving Avril Lavigne, so perhaps I should have predicted that one. But I have to be honest, this one still bugs me to this day. A big part of me is still convinced the scene does exist, or at least did exist. I could truly sit here for days telling you about all of the other Mandela Effect examples I've come across. I've learned about more of them than I ever anticipated throughout my research, and whilst I can't cover them all, I did want to highlight just a few more before we start talking theories. As I was preparing for this episode, I decided to throw the mic to all of you via our social media pages. I asked you to tell me which Mandela Effect was the one you find most bizarre of all, and you gave me some brilliant answers. Some, like Simon and Jane, referenced the Monopoly Man and his monocle, with Simon saying he swears the monocle was present in the illustration. Peter mentioned the Fruit of the Loom cornucopia example, whilst Harriet noted another music video related one. The idea that so many people remember Britney Spears wearing that classic headset microphone in the Oops, I Did It Again video, yet she actually doesn't. Steve echoed the thoughts of my friend Luke, who cited the memory of Walker's salt and vinegar crisps being in a blue packet rather than a green one as their most compelling Mandela effect. Oliver said the one he found strangest was the false memory that Jaws' girlfriend in the 1979 James Bond film Moonraker had braces that had a similar appearance to Jaws' metal teeth, when she actually doesn't have braces at all. Kirsty also noted a film-based example, the belief that the butler in Scary Movie 2 uttered the line, "Take my strong hand," when he actually said, "Take my hand," and then a few lines later, "Take my little hand." Mark mentioned the example that I've had so many discussions about with people in person, the case of the Pokemon character Pikachu's tail. When asked to draw Pikachu from memory, it's incredibly common for people to draw him with a black lightning bolt shape at the tip of his tail. But in reality, his tail is just yellow with a bit of brown shading towards the base. Then we had Andy's comment about the book, film and TV series known as Interview with the Vampire, something that a huge number of people actually remember being called Interview with a Vampire, myself included. Then we had a few notes from people who cited examples that might not be necessarily widely discussed, but are things that they themselves are convinced were once different. Carl mentioned some Midnight Oil song lyrics that he is sure have changed over time, whereas Ellie is certain that the theme song to Michael McIntyre's game show The Wheel has shifted. Then Angharad shared an incredible story about an LP record she used to listen to over and over again with her aunt that was suddenly missing a song she was 100% sure was on it when she rediscovered the record at a later date. I'm so grateful to everyone who left me comments and sent me messages about this topic. It was fantastic to read them all. One of the main reasons I wanted to sort of list all of these Mandela effects sent in by you was not only because they're genuinely incredibly interesting, but also to help demonstrate how widespread this phenomenon really is. Every single person I've spoken to about this recently has at least one of these odd little examples to share that has got under their skin. But what could help to explain the Mandela effect and the odd sensation that comes along with them, that feeling that we're somehow being gaslit by someone or something? It's finally time to take a look at some of the most prevalent theories behind this entertaining yet seriously exasperating happening. Seeing as though I've already touched on this in some of the earlier examples, let's begin with some of the leading explanations favoured by those who take a more rational or skeptical approach, starting with a concept known as the schema theory. In 2022, psychology researchers from the University of Chicago decided to look deeper into the subject of visual Mandela effects, so things like Mr. Monopoly's monocle, and they came to some interesting conclusions. They suggested that at least some visual Mandela effects could be explained by the schema theory. In a nutshell, this theory relates to how the brain structures knowledge and highlights how we can misremember details based on our expectations or associations. This would apply to the Monopoly example for several reasons, including the fact that the Mr. Monopoly character is supposed to be very rich, and a monocle is something we'd typically associate with a wealthy Victorian figure. But the theory wouldn't apply to things like the case of Pikachu's tail. There's no pre-existing association there, as this is a unique fictional character. Some have suggested that people have perhaps been thinking of the black tips of Pikachu's ears when they falsely remembered his tail having a black tip, and the general lightning bolt shape of the tail to explain the pattern. And they've also questioned whether people are getting confused between Pikachu and the later character of Pichu, who does have a fully black tail. But the fact that so many people remember the exact same incorrect design is still very odd to me. However, whilst the University of Chicago researchers weren't able to land on a single scientific explanation for the Mandela effect, they did report another interesting finding. After completing their study and analysing their findings, they discovered that people have a tendency to forget and remember the same things. One of the researchers, Wilma Bainbridge, revealed that, quote, "You would think that because all of us have our own individual experiences throughout our lives, that we'd all have these idiosyncratic differences in our memories. But surprisingly, we find that we tend to remember the same faces and pictures as each other. This consistency in our memories is really powerful, because this means that I can know how memorable certain pictures are. I could quantify it. I could even manipulate the memorability of an image." Essentially, whilst this doesn't help to explain why Mandela effects happen, it could suggest that the reason so many people encounter the effect with the same images, like the Fruit of the Loom logo for example, is because there's something about that logo that lends itself to being falsely remembered. Exactly what these factors might be is something we'll have to watch this space on, but I'm very intrigued by this aspect of their research. Other psychological theories that have been put forward to try and explain the phenomenon include the idea of confabulation, the notion that our brains spontaneously work to fill in the gaps in our memories without us even realizing it, so we can end up truly believing that something is real with all our hearts, even though certain details might be incorrect, but we can't separate the true parts of the memories from the false ones. And then, of course, we have to talk about the idea of suggestibility. The fact is that, largely thanks to things like the internet internet and social media, we live in a much more connected world than ever before. Do people falsely remember movie lines like "Hello, Clarice," or "Luke, I am your father," because they've heard and seen them incorrectly referenced by other people so often that they begin to believe they're accurate? Perhaps they've heard the wrong line said so many times that it's far surpassed the number of times they've actually seen the film in question. So naturally, it's the line they automatically believe to be correct. Whilst I think these potential explanations are very compelling and could definitely be applicable to some occurrences of the Mandela Effect, there's still a big part of me that feels unfulfilled by these theories. And I think the reasons I can't fully accept that the answers lie solely in the earthly realm are: 1, because of how strange it is that so many people can encounter the phenomenon in the exact same way, and 2, because of how unsettling it can feel when you experience a Mandela Effect for yourself. So I wanted to dive a bit deeper into some of the more out there theories that have emerged since the term was coined, and some of these link back to more paranormal or supernatural adjacent topics that we've discussed on the podcast in the past. Now, you might have noticed that during this episode so far, I've referred to Mandela effects as both false memories and alternative memories. And there's a reason for that. One of the leading ideas favoured by people like Fiona Broome and many of those online who consider themselves firmly in the believer camp is that there could be something strange going on regarding alternative or parallel timelines. What if, in a universe similar yet slightly different to ours, Walker's salt and vinegar crisps did used to be in a blue packet rather than a green, for example, but due to some kind of glitch or a form of sliding between these timelines, only certain people remember this alternate reality rather than the one we're living in now. I realise that this sounds very far-fetched, but you might be surprised to learn that the idea is partially rooted in the scientific concept of quantum mechanics, specifically string theory and the multiverse theory. Some physicists believe that there could very well be an infinite number of dimensions or universes out there, which means that at some point in some universe, all of the Mandela effects I've mentioned would have been real. The Fruit of the Loom logo would have featured a cornucopia, and the Skater Boy music video would have included the scene with the old-fashioned TV. But where this idea switches from the scientific to the otherworldly is with this idea of a glitch or a movement between these universes. The concept is both hugely popular and hugely divisive on forums like Reddit, with some users proclaiming that the answer must truly lie in this explanation, whilst others say it's a misinterpretation or an exaggeration of the scientific theory, which I guess is par for the course when it comes to anything that sounds like it would usually be filed under science fiction rather than fact. Another alternative theory that is very popular amongst Mandela Effect enthusiasts is that these bizarre happenings are a result of micro forms of time travel or time slips, possibly caused by things that may have disrupted what Fiona Broome describes as the fabric of our reality, like the tests that have been run within the Large Hadron Collider. Whilst there's obviously no proof of this, I can understand why this notion has gained traction. I remember when the first particle collision experiments were being carried out there in 2010, everyday people were genuinely concerned about what it would mean. Could these tests produce black holes or cause the Earth to somehow implode? It was a big topic of conversation for a while back then, so I wasn't too shocked to learn that this is quite a prominent debate debate in the Mandela Effect's community, especially because the conversation around them really took off not too long after construction on the Large Hadron Collider was finished. I know from the feedback on a couple of our previous episodes that time slips are very interesting to a lot of people, and in this instance, the suggestion seems to be that perhaps small time slips occur and expose certain groups to slightly altered pieces of media, meaning they create real alternative memories that carry through to the normal world. Some people take this a step further and start talking about simulation theory, the idea that the reality we're living in is manufactured and controlled, and that details like whether Britney Spears wears a headset microphone in a music video could be changed at will by whoever or whatever is in charge. If you think about films like The Truman Show, you'll start to get the gist of what this idea involves. Again, there's absolutely no proof of this. And I try to think of these kinds of ideas as more entertaining than serious. And when they're brought up in internet forums, they're actually rejected more often than you'd think. They're definitely interesting to think about, but it's probably not wise to get too caught up in them. So, after all of this, where do I land on the subject of Mandela effects? I actually do think that a number of them could be reasonably explained by the more traditional theories, and I believe social media probably plays more of a role than we realise in the sharing and absorption of these false memories in certain cases. But I just can't shake the feeling that there's something more to this topic, something we don't yet understand. Some of the examples are just too weird and too widespread to be just a mere coincidence that thousands, if not millions of people all share the same incorrect memory. The way that such a lot of people remember learning the word cornucopia because they saw it on a Fruit of the Loom label is one of those examples for me. I believe that one of the reasons we're all so fascinated by Mandela effects is because if we look at statistics from places like YouGov, it seems that there are more people that have experienced this phenomenon than haven't. If you were to ask a room of people whether they'd ever seen a ghost, I'm sure a handful of them would have some kind of spooky story to share, but I bet that the vast majority would have encountered a Mandela effect, even if they didn't realize it. I've spoken to people who initially told me that they didn't think they'd experienced the phenomenon before, until I started telling them about some of the famous examples, which made them realize that one of the false or alternative memories did apply to them too. Whatever the truth may be, you can't deny that this topic is an incredibly intriguing conversation starter, which is why I'm ending today with a question to you. Which Mandela effect do you think is the most fascinating of all? Oh, I absolutely love these kinds of episodes. Sometimes when there isn't a concrete answer, I actually find the whole thing more interesting, as I know I'm going to be keeping a close eye out for new information as and when we may get it. As I say, please do get in touch and share your own thoughts. If you're listening on Spotify, feel free to leave a comment right here on the episode page. It's such a fun and interactive way to keep the discussion going. If you're an early bird listener, there'll also be a poll on the Spotify episode page too, which is another great way to get involved. So before I leave you to mull the Mandela effect topic over, we still have time for our outro feature. So without further ado, here is Weird Media. This week, I actually have a theatre recommendation for you. Aside from the Uncanny Show that I mentioned a few episodes back, I hadn't actually been to the theatre for ages until a couple of weeks ago, particularly to watch a play. But recently, I went with my mum and my sister to the Opera House in Manchester to see the brand new stage production of Single White Female, and it was fantastic. Now, don't judge me, but I haven't actually seen the Single White Female film from the 90s, but it's about one woman who becomes obsessed with another, and I have to say that I loved it. It was a more modern adaptation of the story, but I found it totally captivating. The two female leads are played by Kim Marsh and Lisa Faulkner, and I was so impressed by both of them. I've acted in a play or two myself over the years, and I know how demanding these really high tension, emotional roles can be, and I think they both nailed their respective performances. In fact, the whole cast was brilliant. I'm not going to give details of the plot away, but I think I forgot to both blink and even breathe at certain points. And there was one part where I actually physically jumped in my seat. The way the drama descends into something that's just purely sinister feels really immersive. And honestly, I didn't want it to end. I would have been more than happy if it was a good half an hour longer. Also, the music that was used in the show was right up my street. There were some absolute bangers in there. Any theatre show that makes use of Slipknot songs gets a huge tick of approval from me. My sister and I kept looking over at each other with these excited looks on our faces because so many of our favourite songs kept cropping up. It was brilliant. There were some flashing lights used, so do be warned if that's something you're sensitive to. But otherwise, if it sounds like something you'd enjoy, I believe it's touring until early June this year. So definitely have a check to see whether Single White Female is coming to a theatre near you. Thank you all so much for tuning in to Things Are About to Get Weird today. I hope you found the Mandela Effect topic as intriguing as I do. Down in the show notes or the description box, I'll be including shout outs to all of the sources I used during my research, complete with links if you'd like to do any further reading. Of course, I'll also be listing all of our social media pages and our email address too. Please do leave us a comment if you're listening on Spotify, or get in touch on Instagram, Facebook, Threads, or even TikTok, and let me know your thoughts about today's subject. If you have a second or two, I would be so grateful for a quick rating or review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to subscribe and give this video a thumbs up. Thank you once again for tuning in today. I'll be back again very soon with a brand new strange but true story to tell you. So until next time, take care of yourself and others and keep it weird, but the good kind of weird.